In this video, I will briefly describe what the background and landscape sections are and how to develop them for your own topics. I also will briefly describe the status quo, base case, or current state of affairs policy-wise, and how to identify it for your topics. The exercise for this week will help you apply the readings and this video to your research. The background section of your analysis presents facts to explain the problem and why it is being addressed. It is where your problem statement will be inserted. This section is not theoretical, nor is it subjective. It is all based on data. Think of it as answering the why question. Why is this a problem that decision makers care about? Make the case the problem is worthy of governmental attention and resources. This will build off of your problem and data visualization presentation that you submitted recently. The background section includes data to make the case that your problem is worthy of governmental attention. It's where your graphics and tables will be inserted in your policy analysis. The section is entirely data-based, based on epidemiologic and surveillance data. Teitelbaum and Walensky refer to this section as entirely informational. It's not partisan, it's not ideological. Just tell us the facts. Where will you obtain your data? This is based on your data-related research from federal agencies, from state agencies, local research organizations, advocacy organizations, you name it. You'll want to rely on the best practices in data visualization here as well. The landscape section provides the context for your analysis. You'll discuss key stakeholders, including interest and advocacy groups, policymakers, the public, and target populations. The policy landscape section addresses the factors to consider when analyzing the problem. The key readings for this unit will be from Teitelbaum and Walensky and the Shrieky and Young readings. Key factors that you might consider will include political, economic, practical, social, and/or legal factors. For this class, at a minimum, you'll want to address the political and economic factors, but hopefully other ones as well. Political factors get at issues like, is this a hot-button topic? Is it controversial? Where do key stakeholders stand on the issue? Do they have an opinion? Is there bipartisan support? Are there reasons to act now versus waiting to deal with the problem later? It's a unique window of opportunity. Economic factors get at the economic and monetary impact if the problem were not addressed. Here you definitely want to address things like the cost to society. That could include monetary cost, as well as lost lives, morbidity or mortality, lost productivity or absenteeism, insurance costs, and the like. Other things to consider under economic factors are, how is this affecting the jurisdiction's budget or deficit? Is it costing the jurisdiction money to treat the problem? Basically, how is this problem affecting society or organizations in terms of the bottom line? Legal factors might be new. This is where you're getting at issues that are legal barriers to affecting the problem. So, for example, has Congress given a regulatory agency the authority to issue regulations on a specific topic? If they don't have that authority, then they don't have the legal authority to regulate on an area. Another example might be if there's future litigation as a potential concern, which often is relevant for issues dealing with industry, such as pharma, tobacco, food and beverage, things like that. Practical factors get at issues of whether this is a realistic problem to try and solve. Are there possible public policy solutions for this problem? Thinking about that further in the coming weeks as we deal with policy alternatives, and also when we're talking about market and government factors. If the problem can't be solved, are there reasons and ways to address the problem from a policy standpoint at this point in time? For social factors, you want to think about who is most affected by the problem. Is this an issue of equity, injustice, or fairness? Are there influential or valued groups, according to the client, who are most affected by the problem? Next week, when we deal with policy goals, you'll want to think about this in particular. If you've identified targeted universalism as a key policy goal, then you definitely need to be sure to address social factors in your policy landscape. More on that forthcoming. In the ungraded exercise for this week, you will want to identify which factors specifically apply to your problem and describe them in detail, backed up by evidence. Please note, not all factors will apply, so please do not send in a document that provides examples for every factor. Usually they're not all relevant. Hone in on the ones that are most relevant for your problem. The policy history helps you to explain How did we get to where we are today relative to policymaking in this area? It includes the full range of policy actions taken to date. Be sure to consider the full range of things that governments do from BARDOC Appendix B, and also consult the Shrieky and Young reading for this week. Recall that prior decisions to do nothing were active decisions. So if nothing has happened to date, explain why and what challenges prevented something from being enacted. Where we find information on the policy history? Look at the policy database resources under Resources in the Blackboard site. Through the library, you can search Lexis for access to state laws. You can also reach out to Rosie Henneke for help in where and how to locate this information. Just a reminder, she actually has a discussion board set up just for this course and has office hours both in person and online. I encourage you to reach out to her, not just for help with the policy history, but in locating information for your problem or background section. You should not reach out to her until you've attempted to locate material on your own, so you can ask informed questions. The status quo, or the base case, represents the policies or governmental programs on the books in your jurisdiction of interest. As I noted on the prior slide, if there are no policies or programs on the books, then that is the status quo. The status quo is the alternative against which you will compare all other alternatives. As I have noted several times already in this presentation, you'll want to consult the BARDOC's Appendix B and the Shrieky and Young readings for a clear sense as to what's fair game for the status quo. As you can see from this slide, it includes a range of options, and it's not just legislation or regulations. It also includes things like appropriations or funding from the government for programs. It includes programs specifically funded by the government. It includes educational awareness campaigns operated by or funded by the government. And it includes research being supported by the government. One thing that always confuses students is that the status quo, and your alternatives for that matter, are not what advocacy organizations or private organizations may or may not be doing. The goal of this project is to understand what the government and your jurisdiction of interest has or has not done to address this problem. The other thing to know about the status quo is that it does not include things that have failed to pass or that are proposed. Those can be alternatives that you may eventually consider. Things that have failed to pass will be noted in your policy history, but your status quo would be nothing on the books if there's nothing currently. Things that have been proposed may be an alternative that you may consider, but they also are not part of the status quo. Finally, your focus with the status quo is what is on the books in your jurisdiction of interest. It does not include what your neighboring state or city is doing. If you're focused on national issues, it does not include what the states have done. That information can all be mentioned in the background section of your paper and might inform your other alternatives, but they are not part of the status quo. So once you have identified the status quo, or your base case, you want to think about the rationale for governmental intervention. It's going to fall into two camps, which we'll talk about further in the coming learning unit. But specifically, you're going to think about market failures and government failures. In next week's learning unit, we'll go into more detail about what market failures and government failures are. But as you're thinking about your background paper, you really want to think about the connection between your status quo and the market and government failures, which precipitated or are associated with the status quo. So for this week, you should be thinking about and researching your status quo. And for next week, you'll want to think about what the failures are and how they came to be vis-a-vis the status quo. More on that to come. As you saw from the readings this week, especially in BARDOC Appendix B, there are a host of big P policy options that are available to you as a policy analyst. Not just for your alternatives that you'll eventually be considering, but you also need to look at this list of policy strategies and options and think about them vis-a-vis your status quo. Basically, anything that's on this first column in the list under the big P policy options should be considered for your status quo. So in other words, have there been any appropriations or specific budget line items relative to your program or policy? Is there some type of ban or restriction regulating what's going on? Are there legal sanctions or deterrent strategies in place? Are there educational programs that can include social marketing programs as well as educational campaigns? Are grants being provided to conduct more research or to provide services? So on and so forth. So as you think about the status quo for your problem area. You want to be wide, cast a wide net in terms of the range of possible quote-unquote policies that are on the books relative to your status quo. That range of policies should be drawn from the types of things that are on this list here and as described in Bar Doc Appendix B. One thing to note with this table, the second column tells you the primary authority and the third column tells you the secondary authority. With the primary authority, I'm basically telling you with an L that it's legislative authority primarily, and with an R, secondary authority, meaning that an executive branch agency may have responsibility for implementation or even in some cases developing regulations. So it doesn't have to just be L or it doesn't have to just be R. But when you're thinking about your status quo and eventually your policy options, you need to think about them vis-a-vis your client and what types of policies are appropriate given your client. We'll talk more about that as we get into alternatives. For right now, you should be focusing on researching and identifying the range of things that are currently going on in your jurisdiction of interest relative to your problem according to the range of policies that are listed here. I do not expect you to have all of these. Most of you will only be listing one or two different types of policies that are on the books. And by saying different types of policies, I mean something along these lines on this list. Now it's time for you to get started researching the policy landscape and the status quo for your problem. You want to spend time over the coming week really doing this research. The more effort you put in now, the less work you'll need to do when it comes time for your paper that's due in a few weeks. There's a worksheet that's provided on Blackboard under exercises and also under the policy landscape and status quo learning unit that you should complete and post to Blackboard by no later than 9 a.m. at class time next week, and also bring to class on October 2nd for the group discussion. The more details you provide in the worksheet, the easier it will be for us to provide you with feedback, but also for you to use that to develop your paper going forward. Please pay careful attention to Bar Doc Appendix B and what I've said in this recording relative to what qualifies for the status quo. It'll be very important to think about. Likewise, with the policy landscape, you're not going to cover every factor under the sun. You want to hone in on the major things. That's the goal here. Be parsimonious and really focus on what's really important and what really matters. What are the priority issues and what are the priority policy strategies that are currently in place for the status quo? Look forward to seeing where you go with this.